The wind sliced through the empty streets of Brookdale, a city where dreams often died before they had the chance to bloom. Jake, only 12 years old, walked with his head down, his thin hoodie doing little to shield him from the brutal cold. His sneakers, barely holding together, slapped against the cracked pavement, each step sending a jolt of pain through his frozen feet. His stomach had been empty since the night before, but hunger had become just another dull ache, one he had learned to ignore. The neighborhood around him was silent, except for the occasional wail of a siren in the distance. Storefronts were boarded up, the streetlights flickered weakly, and the few people still outside walked fast, avoiding eye contact. This was Brookdale's forgotten side, the side where buses ran late, grocery stores sold, expired food at double the price, and landlords didn't fix what was broken, because they knew no one could afford to leave. Jake clutched the small burlap bag slung over his shoulder. It was nearly empty except for a few crumpled soda cans he had collected, barely worth $1 at the recycling center. Maybe enough for a piece of bread if the cashier at the corner store was feeling generous. As he turned a corner, the neon lights of a coffee shop illuminated a group of kids his age, well-dressed, warm, federal. He braced himself. He knew what was coming. The hunt had begun. The neon glow of the coffee shop painted streaks of red and white across the wet pavement as Jake forced himself to keep walking, his heartbeat hammered in his ears. He didn't need to look up to know that the group of kids lounging under the awning had already spotted him. "Hey, look who it is! Our favorite little garbage collector," sneered Dylan, the tallest of the group, his brand name coat zipped up to his chin. The others laughed, their voices sharp, cruel. Jake didn't stop, didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. "Find anything good today?" Another voice called out, dripping with mockery. "Maybe some new shoes? Those things on your feet look like they're holding on for dear life." The laughter cut through the cold, louder than the wind. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept moving. He would not give them the satisfaction. He turned down a side street, his fingers tightening around the empty bag on his shoulder. The voices faded, but the sting of their words lingered, wrapping around him like a noose. They would never understand what it was like to go home to an apartment with no heat, to hear your little sister ask if there would be food tomorrow and not have an answer. The wind howled through the skeletal trees of Brookdale Park, rattling the rusted swings. Jake hadn't meant to stop here, but something pulled him in. That's when he saw him. An old man slumped on a weathered bench near the broken fountain. His hands trembled in his lap, his thin jacket barely covering his frail body. His white hair, wild from the wind, stuck out in tufts, and his pale face was lined with deep creases. He wasn't moving. Jake hesitated. This wasn't his problem. But something about the way the old man just sat there, so small, so lost, made Jake pause. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Sir?" His voice felt too loud in the eerie stillness. Nothing. Jake tried again, softer. "Hey, are you okay?" This time, the man's head lifted, his washed-out blue eyes meeting Jake's for a fleeting moment before clouding over again, like a fog rolling in. I don't know," the old man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced around the empty park. There was no one else. No one coming. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Be better than the world is to you." His fingers were numb, his stomach hollow, his body shaking from the cold. He had nothing to give. But he understood this feeling, the quiet suffering, the fear of being invisible. With a deep breath, Jake pulled off his hoodie and draped it over the man's shoulders. The man flinched slightly at the warmth, blinking up at him. Jake exhaled, making his decision. "Come on," he muttered. "You can stay with me for the night." The old man stared at him. "Home?" Jake nodded, ignoring the voice in his head screaming this was a mistake. "Just for tonight. You can't stay out here." For a long moment, the man didn't move. Then, slowly, his frail fingers curled around Jake's sleeve, like a child afraid of getting lost. Jake swallowed hard, adjusting his grip on the burlap bag as he helped the man to his feet. The wind cut through his now bare arms, but he ignored it. He had made his choice. and nothing would ever be the same again. What would you do in Jake's situation? Would you take the old man in or walk away? Comment below. If you think Jake made the right decision, hit the like button. If you would have done something different, comment your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, because you won't believe what happens next. Jake's hands trembled as he guided the old man up the crumbling steps of his apartment building. The cold gnawed at his exposed arms, but he gritted his teeth and pressed forward. The man wobbled slightly, his breath uneven, and Jake steadied him, his own stomach twisting with nerves. What was he doing? His mother was going to be furious. Inside, the air was stale with the lingering scent of dampness and cigarettes. The flickering hallway light barely illuminated the peeling wallpaper and scuffed floors. Jake hesitated at the door, inhaling sharply before pushing it open. His mother, Camille, sat at the small kitchen table, hunched over a pile of overdue bills. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose bun, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Across the room, his 6-year-old sister, Mia, curled up on their worn-out couch, flipping through a tattered picture book. As the door creaked, Camille looked up. The moment her eyes landed on the frail old man beside Jake, her face hardened with confusion and something dangerously close to anger. She stood abruptly, her gaze shifting between them. "Jake," she said, her voice slow, measured. "Who is this?" Jake swallowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. I found him in the park. He was alone, freezing. He doesn't remember where he's supposed to be." Camille's expression flickered. Frustration, concern, a war between instinct and reality. She crossed her arms. "Jake, we barely have enough for ourselves. We can't just—" Then she stopped. Her eyes landed on the old man's trembling hands, the bluish tinge to his lips, the way his body sagged under the weight of exhaustion and hunger. Her arms, still crossed, loosened slightly. The silence in the room was thick. Jake felt his throat tighten. He had brought this stranger here, but now he didn't know what to say. Then, softly, Camille exhaled. "I don't have much," she murmured, eyes locked on the man. "But come in. Warm yourself up." Relief flooded Jake as he helped the man to the rickety chair at the table. Camille moved swiftly, pulling a pot from the stove, the faint scent of watered-down broth filling the air. Mia peeked over the couch, wide-eyed but curious. She slid off and padded over in bare feet, her tiny hands clutching a thin, patched-up blanket. Without hesitation, she draped it over the old man's lap, smoothing the fabric like she was tucking in one of her dolls. "There," she whispered. The man blinked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not quite understanding, but something close to gratitude. His lips parted, but no words came out. Camille placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him. The broth was thin, the single slice of bread slightly stale, but it was warm. Jake sat down across from the old man, watching as he lifted his spoon with a trembling hand. He took a slow sip. His breath hitched. For a long moment, he just stared at the bowl, like it was something he had forgotten existed. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Then, in the quietest voice, he whispered, "Thank you." Something twisted deep in Jake's chest. He had seen that look before. The way people's faces changed when they realized someone had been kind to them when they least expected it. This man wasn't just cold. He wasn't just lost. He had been invisible. But not tonight. Tonight, he was home. The dim kitchen light flickered overhead as Jake sat cross-legged on the floor beside the couch. His legs were stiff, his body exhausted, but sleep refused to come. Instead, his gaze lingered on the old man, now curled beneath Mia's tattered blanket, his breathing steady but uneven. The man, this stranger, had finally fallen asleep, but his hands still twitched slightly, his face occasionally creasing in silent distress, as if his mind were still lost in the fog that had taken his memory. Jake had seen exhaustion before. He'd seen his mother collapse onto the couch after working a double shift, seen Mia rub at her eyes when hunger kept her awake. But this was different. This wasn't just a man who was tired. This was a man who was lost. Jake's eyes drifted lower, scanning the man's frail arms, his thin fingers now still against the rough fabric of the couch. That's when something caught his attention. a glint of silver against his wrist. A bracelet. It was thin, worn down, but still intact. Carefully, Jake leaned closer, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. The surface was slightly scratched, the edges dulled with time. But there, etched into the underside, was something more. Numbers. Jake squinted, his heart hammering. It was a phone number. His mind raced. Could this be the key to who this man was? Could someone be looking for him? He hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, where his mother sat silently at the table, staring at a pile of bills she couldn't afford to pay. She had already done enough tonight. This he could handle. Carefully, he pushed himself to his feet, moving toward the small landline phone they kept on the counter. The buttons were worn, some barely legible, but his fingers moved on instinct, pressing the numbers into place. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a voice. Hello? A man's voice, sharp, urgent. Jake hesitated, glancing at the old man, still asleep on the couch. Then, carefully, he spoke. Hi. I think I found someone who belongs to you. A long pause. Then, the voice on the other end sharpened. Who is this? Jake swallowed. My name's Jake. I found an old man in the park. He was alone. He didn't know where he was. He had this bracelet with this number. Silence, thick, heavy. Then, a sharp inhale. Oh my God! Jake flinched at the raw desperation in the man's voice. Where is he? The words tumbled out, frantic, unsteady. Is he okay? Is he hurt? Jake's grip tightened around the phone. He's safe. His eyes flicked to the couch. He was freezing when I found him, but he's okay now. He's resting. A shaky exhale from the other end. Then, softer. His name is James Whitmore. He's my father. Jake's breath caught. He has early-stage dementia, the man continued, his voice breaking. I took him to the park today for some fresh air, and I turned my back for 1 second to take a call. When I looked up, he was gone. Jake closed his eyes, the weight of it settling deep in his chest. This wasn't just some old man lost in the cold. This was someone's father, someone's family. I've been looking for him for hours, the man continued, his voice thick with emotion. I thought... He cut himself off, as if the thought was too painful to say aloud. Then, steadier now. Where are you? I'm coming to get him. Jake hesitated. He wasn't used to trusting strangers. Wasn't used to giving out their address to people he didn't know, especially someone who sounded like they came from a world so far removed from his. But this man, he didn't sound like someone pretending to care. He sounded like someone who had just been given back something he thought he had lost forever. Jake swallowed hard and told him where to find them. And just like that, everything changed. The quiet hum of the street was broken by the distant growl of an approaching engine. Jake stood near the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered outside. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop in front of the building. Its polished exterior gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlights. Too clean, too foreign for a place like this. The engine cut off. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the door swung open. A man stepped out, his movements sharp, controlled. He was tall, dressed in an expensive wool coat, his polished shoes tapping softly against the cracked pavement. His face, though composed, carried a weight of urgency, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit street before locking onto the entrance of the building. Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe someone older, someone ragged with worry. But this man, Carter Whitmore, looked like he belonged to a world Jake had only ever seen in passing. The kind of world where people never had to wonder when their next meal would be. Jake barely had time to react before there was a knock at the door. Firm, deliberate. His mother stood from the kitchen table, exchanging a wary glance with him before stepping forward. She cracked the door open just enough to see who stood on the other side. A pause, then softly, "You must be Carter." The man nodded once. "Yes, I'm looking for my father." His voice, though calm, carried an edge, like he was barely holding himself together. Camille stepped back, allowing him inside. Carter barely spared the apartment a glance before his gaze landed on the couch. His breath hitched. There, curled beneath a worn-out blanket, was James Whitmore. His frail body was still, his lined face softer now in sleep, free of the confusion that had clouded it earlier. Carter exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping, as if some unbearable weight had been lifted from them. His hand came up to his mouth, fingers pressing against his lips as he stepped closer. "Dad!" The whisper barely escaped, but it carried the force of everything he had been holding in. Jake shifted uncomfortably, watching as Carter hesitated, his fingers hovering just above his father's shoulder, as if afraid that touching him would wake him, would shatter the fragile relief of this moment. Camille crossed her arms, observing the man carefully. He was alone, she said finally. Lost. Freezing. Carter exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I know, he murmured. He's been getting worse. The memory loss. The confusion. I should have... His voice caught, frustration and guilt tightening his expression. Jake had seen that look before. The way people's faces twisted when they realized they had failed someone they loved. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, Carter turned, really looking at Jake for the first time. His gaze flicked over the threadbare hoodie, the sneakers barely held together, the apartment that, despite its warmth, was undeniably small, undeniably struggling. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes. He took a step forward. Then, without warning, he clasped Jake's hand in both of his own. His grip was firm, but not overpowering. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved him. Jake shifted under the intensity of it. I just did what anyone would do. Carter studied him. Then, softly, no. Not everyone would. A beat passed. Then Carter reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick white envelope. He extended it toward Camille. She stiffened immediately. We don't take handouts. Carter's lips quirked upward, almost amused, but his voice remained gentle. It's not a handout. It's a thank you. Camille hesitated. Jake could see the way her fingers twitched, the way her jaw clenched slightly, the same way it always did when she was caught between pride and necessity. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Carter nodded, satisfied. Then his gaze returned to Jake. Are you in school? Jake froze. His stomach twisted. He glanced at his mother, who looked away. Carter's gaze sharpened. He already knew the answer. Do you want to be? Jake's throat felt tight. He wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to say yes. But wanting something didn't make it possible. He shrugged. I mean, yeah, but we don't exactly have... Carter cut him off with a small smile. You do now. Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. I'll cover it, Carter continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tuition, supplies, whatever you need. All I ask is that you keep doing what you're doing. Keep working hard. Keep being the kind of person who does the right thing, even when no one's watching. Jake's chest tightened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Why? His voice was quiet. Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, simply, because the world needs more people like you. And just like that, everything changed. For the next few days, life in Jake's apartment felt different. Lighter. It wasn't just the thick envelope Carter Whitmore had left behind, though that alone had been enough to ease some of the weight pressing down on his mother's shoulders. No, it was something else. It was hope. Jake still wasn't sure if he believed in luck, but for the first time in his life, it felt like something had shifted. Like maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be so hard forever. The morning after Carter left, Camille sat at the kitchen table, the envelope open beside her. She had counted the money twice, as if expecting it to vanish. Her hands trembled slightly when she set it down. This is enough to cover rent for 6 months. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She ran a hand through her curls, exhaling sharply. Enough to keep the lights on, to buy groceries, to... She trailed off, shaking her head in disbelief. Jake sat across from her, still trying to process it all. The idea that one act of kindness, one decision, could change everything. And then came the part that truly knocked the breath out of him. Camille reached for a second envelope, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper. She slid it toward Jake. His pulse quickened. Carter came through on his promise, she said softly. It's your school registration. He already paid for everything. You start on Monday. Jake's stomach twisted. He stared at the envelope, his fingers hovering over the edge. School. A real school. Not dodging hall monitors because He hadn't been enrolled in months, not lying about homework he never got assigned. A real, actual chance. He swallowed hard. What if I don't fit in? The words escaped before he could stop them. Camille's gaze softened. You already know what it's like to survive, Jake. Now, maybe it's time to learn what it's like to thrive. Her words settled deep. A challenge, a promise, a truth. That Monday, Jake stood outside Brookdale Academy, a backpack, new, heavier than he was used to, slung over his shoulders. The school was massive, nothing like the rundown buildings he had grown up in. The students wore nice clothes, walked with confidence, their laughter filling the air. Jake felt out of place. Then, across the street, he spotted Carter's car idling at the curb. The man inside didn't wave, didn't call out. He just gave a small nod, as if to say, "You've got this." Jake exhaled, gripping the strap of his backpack. One step, then another, and just like that, he walked through the doors. What do you think will happen next? Will Jake adjust to his new school? Will his past come back to haunt him? Drop a 1 in the comments if you're rooting for Jake. Hit like if you think he made the right choice. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Jake's journey. Jake's footsteps echoed in the wide, gleaming hallways of Brookdale Academy. The polished floors, the pristine lockers, the soft murmur of students chatting in clusters. It all felt foreign. He adjusted the strap of his new backpack, feeling the weight of it against his shoulder. It was strange how something as simple as school supplies could feel so heavy. Like he was carrying more than just books, like he was carrying an entire life he wasn't sure belonged to him. He kept his head down, walking quickly, but it didn't take long for the whispers to start. Who's the new kid? I heard he got in on a scholarship. He doesn't look like he belongs here. Jake clenched his jaw. He was used to people talking about him, used to being underestimated, ignored. But here it was different. It wasn't just the stares. It was the way people looked at him, like he was a puzzle piece shoved into the wrong box. And then, just as he turned the corner, he ran straight into Dylan. Dylan Carmichael. The same kid who used to mock him outside the coffee shop. The same kid whose expensive jacket had never known a day of struggle. Jake took a step back, his pulse spiking. Of course. Of course he went here. Dylan's smirk widened. Well, look who finally crawled out of the gutter. A ripple of laughter came from the group standing behind him. Jake forced himself to breathe. Not here, not now. Didn't think they let charity cases into Brookdale. Dylan's voice dripped with amusement, but his eyes, they were sharp, calculating. Jake squared his shoulders. He wasn't going to let this kid get to him. But then, Dylan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough so that only Jake could hear. You can dress up all you want, but you'll always be the same street rat. Something inside Jake snapped. His fists clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming to react, to fight back, to prove Dylan wrong. But then, he remembered Carter's words. Keep being the kind of person who does the right thing, even when no one's watching. Jake exhaled sharply, forcing himself to let go of the anger burning in his chest. He wouldn't give Dylan what he wanted. Instead, he took a step around him. Didn't look back, didn't say a word. For the first time, Dylan faltered. He had expected a fight. He had wanted one. But Jake had something better. He had a future. And no one, not Dylan, not anyone, was going to take that away from him. The days at Brookdale Academy were harder than Jake had imagined. It wasn't just the academics, though that was a challenge in itself. It was the weight of everything. The constant whispers, the stares, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in. Every hallway, every classroom, every lunch break felt like a battlefield he had to navigate alone. But Jake didn't back down. He stayed late in the library, his fingers aching as he scribbled notes and borrowed textbooks. He asked questions, even when it made him stand out. He studied until his eyes burned, determined not to waste the opportunity Carter had given him. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Like now. Jake sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a dense math textbook. The numbers blurred together, his frustration mounting. What if he wasn't smart enough for this? What if he failed? What if... A small hand landed on his shoulder. Jake looked up to see Mia, her big brown eyes searching his. Are we okay now? She asked softly. Jake swallowed, glancing around their tiny apartment. The flickering kitchen light had been replaced with a steady glow. The cabinets weren't full, but they weren't empty either. Their mother, Camille, had found a job that didn't leave her collapsing from exhaustion every night. For the first time in his life, there was stability. There was hope. Jake reached out, ruffling Mia's curls. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think we are." Mia beamed, her small arms wrapping around his waist before she scampered off to her room. Jake let out a slow breath, staring at the open textbook in front of him. The equations still didn't make sense, but that didn't mean they never would. He straightened his shoulders, gripping his pencil a little tighter. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was moving forward, and no matter how hard it got, he wasn't going back.